For decades, Mel Brooks and Rob Reiner have been seen as one of Hollywood's most unexpected but enduring creative connections. One known for fearless comedy, the other for thoughtful storytelling, their relationship was often described as warm, respectful, and uncomplicated. But those who worked closely with them always hinted there was more beneath the surface, more history, more influence, and more unspoken truth than interviews ever revealed. In his later reflections, Mel Brooks began speaking with a level of openness that surprised even longtime fans. With time passing and legacies firmly established, Brooks no longer felt the need to protect myths or soften reality. What he shared about Rob Reiner wasn't scandalous, but it was honest. And that honesty changed how many people viewed their creative bond. Brooks revealed that Reiner was not just a collaborator or protege, but a defining presence in his life, someone who challenged him, questioned him, and, at times, forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about leadership, control, and creative freedom. Their relationship was built on trust, but also tension. Respect, but not blind agreement. What makes these revelations so powerful is the timing. When careers are still unfolding, silence often protects momentum. But when time has done its work, truth becomes less risky and more meaningful. Brooks' words feel less like confession and more like reflection, shaped by loss, memory, and clarity. In this video, we'll explore what Mel Brooks finally revealed about Rob Reiner, why he chose to speak with such honesty, and how this truth reshapes the story of one of Hollywood's most influential creative relationships. When Mel Brooks first crossed paths with Rob Reiner, it wasn't obvious that the two would become such a defining presence in each other's creative lives. Brooks was already an established force in comedy, known for pushing boundaries and reshaping what satire could do in American cinema. Reiner, by contrast, was still carving out his identity, transitioning from performer to director, searching for a voice that felt both personal and lasting. What Brooks later admitted is that this imbalance of experience quietly shaped everything that followed. In his later reflections, Brooks acknowledged that he initially underestimated how deeply Reiner thought about storytelling. Reiner wasn't interested in jokes for their own sake. He cared about structure, emotional truth, and audience connection. That seriousness sometimes clashed with Brooks' instinctive, high-energy comedic style. At the time, Brooks brushed it off as youthful intensity. Years later, he recognized it as discipline. Brooks revealed that their earliest creative exchanges were not always comfortable. Reiner asked questions others didn't. He challenged decisions that had gone unquestioned for years. For someone as accomplished as Brooks, that kind of pushback was unusual. Yet, instead of shutting it down, Brooks allowed it. Not because he needed it, but because something about Reiner's approach felt sincere rather than confrontational. What Brooks later described as the truth was that Reiner forced him to slow down. Comedy, Brooks realized, didn't lose power when it was carefully shaped. In fact, it often gained weight. Reiner's insistence on clarity, intention, and emotional grounding subtly influenced Brooks' thinking. Even when Brooks didn't consciously admit it at the time, there was also an unspoken lesson about leadership. Brooks had built his career on instinct and confidence. Reiner approached leadership through preparation and listening. Watching Reiner work showed Brooks that authority didn't always have to be loud. It could be quiet, firm, and consistent. That realization stayed with him long after their most active collaborations ended. In his later years, Brooks admitted that he rarely said this publicly because Hollywood rewards certainty, not vulnerability. Admitting that someone younger influenced you can feel like diminishing your own legacy. But time softened that fear. Brooks came to see influence not as a weakness, but as proof of creative vitality. Brooks also spoke about how Reiner's moral compass affected him. Reiner believed deeply that stories carried responsibility, that what you put on screen shapes how audiences see the world. Brooks, known for pushing limits, didn't always frame his work that way early on. But Reiner's perspective planted a seed. Over time, Brooks became more aware of intention behind humor, not just impact. Another truth Brooks finally acknowledged was that their relationship worked because it wasn't built on agreement. They respected each other precisely because they didn't think alike. Reiner didn't try to imitate Brooks, and Brooks didn't try to mold Reiner into a copy of himself. That distance preserved authenticity. Looking back, Brooks described Reiner as someone who reminded him why he fell in love with storytelling in the first place. Not fame, not applause, but connection. The quiet moment when an audience feels understood. That reminder, Brooks said, became more valuable with age. This first truth Mel Brooks revealed is subtle but powerful. Rob Reiner didn't just collaborate with him, he recalibrated him. Not by force, but by example. Not by criticism, but by conviction. And as Brooks began to confront his own mortality, that realization mattered more than awards or box office numbers. Because in the end, the legacy that lasts longest isn't what you made alone, but how others changed you along the way. As time passed, Mel Brooks began to understand that what made Rob Reiner so influential wasn't just his talent, but his patience. In an industry obsessed with speed, quick results, fast scripts, immediate reactions, Reiner worked deliberately. Brooks later admitted that this difference initially frustrated him. Brooks thrived on momentum and instinct, while Reiner believed that the best ideas needed room to breathe. What Brooks didn't realize then was that this contrast would quietly strengthen both of them. Brooks revealed that Reiner had a rare ability to listen without surrendering his vision. He absorbed feedback, considered opposing views, and still moved forward with calm certainty. For Brooks, who had spent years defending bold choices against critics and studios alike, this approach felt almost foreign. Yet over time, he began to see its power. Reiner didn't dominate a room. He guided it. One of the truths Brooks finally spoke about was how Reiner handled disagreement. Arguments weren't emotional or personal. They were focused on the work. That separation between ego and outcome left a lasting impression. Brooks realized that many creative conflicts become destructive, not because of ideas, but because of pride. Reiner's refusal to personalize conflict kept collaboration intact. Even under pressure. Brooks also reflected on moments when Reiner chose restraint over spectacle. Where Brooks might have leaned into exaggeration, Reiner often pulled back, asking whether a moment served the story or distracted from it. At the time, Brooks sometimes resisted. Years later, he admitted that Reiner was often right. Restraint, when intentional, could be more powerful than excess. Another important truth Brooks shared was that Reiner never chased approval. While Hollywood constantly shifts with trends, Reiner anchored himself in principle. He cared deeply about audience trust, believing that once broken, it was nearly impossible to restore. That belief influenced how Brooks later viewed longevity. Making people laugh once was easy. Earning their respect over decades was harder. Brooks also spoke about the quiet confidence Reiner carried. He didn't rely on reputation to command respect. He relied on preparation. That discipline reminded Brooks that confidence doesn't come from past success but from present commitment. Even as Brooks' own career was celebrated, this lesson stayed relevant. There was also an emotional layer Brooks hadn't fully acknowledged before. Reiner represented a generational shift, a reminder that storytelling evolves and that resisting change only isolates you. Instead of feeling threatened, Brooks allowed himself to be curious. That curiosity kept his creative spirit alive far longer than stubbornness ever could have. In reflecting on this, Brooks admitted that the hardest truth to accept was how much Reiner influenced his later mindset without him realizing it. Influence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's absorbed slowly, shaping decisions long after the source is forgotten. Only in hindsight did Brooks connect those dots. Brooks also acknowledged that Reiner's respect for collaborators changed how he viewed leadership. Reiner believed that everyone on set mattered, not just the loudest voice. That belief created environments where people felt safe to contribute. Brooks later recognized how rare and valuable that atmosphere was. What makes this truth resonate is that Brooks didn't frame it as regret. He framed it as gratitude. Gratitude for being challenged, for being questioned, and for being reminded that even legends have room to grow. Reiner didn't diminish Brooks' legacy, he expanded it. This second truth reveals something deeply human. Even at the height of success, learning never stops. And sometimes, the people who teach us the most are the ones who quietly refuse to let us settle. As Mel Brooks grew older, the way he interpreted his own past began to shift. Achievements that once felt central slowly gave way to questions about meaning, influence, and responsibility. It was during this reflective period that Brooks began to openly acknowledge a deeper truth about Rob Reiner 1. That had little to do with comedy or directing techniques, and everything to do with values. Brooks admitted that Reiner approached storytelling as a form of stewardship. He believed stories belong not just to their creators, but to the audience and the culture absorbing them. This belief affected how Reiner made decisions, especially when faced with shortcuts or easy wins. Brooks, known for bold satire, didn't always operate from that place early in his career. But Reiner's perspective lingered, slowly reshaping how Brooks evaluated his own work. One of the most striking truths Brooks shared was that Reiner taught him the importance of accountability. Not in a disciplinary sense, but in a moral one. Reiner questioned why certain stories were told, not just how. He believed intention mattered as much as execution. For Brooks, this reframing was uncomfortable at first. Comedy had always been about freedom. Reiner introduced the idea that freedom and responsibility could coexist. Brooks also reflected on how Reiner handled success. Where many in Hollywood become defensive after acclaim, Reiner became more introspective. Success to him wasn't proof of infallibility, it was a reminder to be careful. Brooks later realized how rare that mindset was. Fame often hardens people. Reiner allowed it to soften him. There was also an honesty in Reiner's self-assessment that Brooks admired. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He asked questions openly. That humility created trust, both on set and off. Brooks admitted that watching this taught him that authority doesn't require certainty, it requires sincerity. Another truth Brooks acknowledged was that Reiner's influence extended beyond the professional. Conversations often drifted into ethics, history, and legacy. They discussed how films age, how audiences change, and how responsibility shifts over time. These weren't conversations Brooks expected to have when he first entered comedy. But they became some of the most meaningful. Brooks also recognized that Reiner's willingness to stand firm on principles sometimes came at a cost. Saying no in Hollywood often closes doors. Reiner accepted that risk. Brooks, reflecting later, realized that longevity wasn't just about staying relevant, it was about staying aligned with your values. That realization deepened his respect for Reiner. Perhaps the most personal truth Brooks shared was that Reiner helped him make peace with imperfection. Not every project needed to be louder, bigger, or sharper than the last. Some needed to be quieter. That permission to evolve rather than escalate was liberating. As Brooks faced his own legacy, these lessons felt increasingly important. Awards fade. Box office numbers blur. But values endure. Reiner's influence, Brooks realized, lived in those invisible spaces choices made. Lines not crossed, moments shaped with care. In this third truth, Mel Brooks wasn't revealing a secret about Rob Reiner. He was revealing something about himself. That growth didn't end with success. That humility can arrive late, but still matter deeply. And in acknowledging this, Brooks showed that the truest measure of a career isn't how loudly it's celebrated, but how thoughtfully it's remembered. In the final years of his life, Mel Brooks began speaking with a clarity that only time can bring. With nothing left to prove and no legacy left to protect, his reflections about Rob Reiner became quieter but also more precise. What Brooks finally shared wasn't dramatic or controversial. It was something far more lasting: recognition. Brooks acknowledged that Rob Reiner represented a turning point not in fame or success, but in understanding what it means to lead with purpose. Looking back, Brooks saw that many of the choices he made later in his career were influenced by lessons he hadn't consciously credited at the time. Reiner's influence had woven itself into Brooks' instincts. One of the final truths Brooks revealed was about restraint. He admitted that early in his career he equated boldness with impact. Reiner taught him that impact could also come from silence, from allowing a moment to breathe. That lesson reshaped how Brooks viewed storytelling. Not every scene needed to announce itself. Some simply needed to exist honestly. Brooks also spoke about trust specifically, the trust Reiner placed in audiences. Reiner believed viewers were intelligent, perceptive, and emotionally capable. He resisted over-explaining or manipulating reactions. Brooks came to admire that confidence. It reminded him that respecting an audience is a form of integrity. As Brooks reflected on their relationship, he emphasized that Reiner never sought control for its own sake. His firmness came from commitment, not ego. That distinction mattered deeply to Brooks later in life. He recognized how often leadership is misunderstood as dominance, when in reality it is service to the story, to collaborators, and to the audience. Another truth Brooks finally shared was gratitude for discomfort. Reiner challenged him at moments when it would have been easier to stay comfortable. Those challenges weren't confrontational, but they were persistent. Brooks admitted that growth rarely feels pleasant in the moment. Only later does its value become clear. In speaking about Reiner, Brooks also confronted a broader truth about creative legacy. Influence isn't measured only by what you create, but by what you inspire in others. Reiner's greatest contribution, Brooks believed, wasn't a single film or project, it was the standard he set for how to work with care, honesty, and intention. What makes this final reflection powerful is its humility. Brooks didn't frame himself as the teacher or the authority. He framed himself as a lifelong student. That perspective, he felt, kept him open long after many of his peers had closed themselves off. In the end, the truth Mel Brooks finally told about Rob Reiner was simple. Some people leave marks that don't fade with time. They deepen, they clarify, and they guide you long after the collaboration ends. Brooks understood that his own legacy would be judged not just by laughter, but by influence, by the values passed forward, by the care taken when it mattered most.